The sinking of the MV Wilhelm Gustloff stands as one of the most tragic and lesser-known maritime disasters in history. On January 30th, 1945, the ship embarked on a perilous journey from Gotenhafen to Kiel, carrying over 10,000 passengers, mostly civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet army during the final stages of World War II. What was meant to be an escape from terror turned into a nightmarish catastrophe when a Soviet submarine torpedoed the ship, leading to the loss of more than 9,000 lives. Despite the immense scale of the disaster, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff remains overshadowed by the broader horrors of war, and the memory of its victims has largely faded from public consciousness. As World War II entered its final months, January 1945 saw the Third Reich in desperate retreat. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces advanced rapidly into East Prussia, bringing terror and destruction to German-occupied territories. The civilian population, made up of women, children, and the elderly, fled westward, seeking refuge from the approaching Soviet army. Among them was the overcrowded MV Wilhelm Gustloff, a German ocean liner turned military transport ship, which was part of Operation Hannibal, one of the largest sea evacuations in history. On January 30th, 1945, the Wilhelm Gustloff left the port of Gotenhafen, now Gdynia, Poland, carrying an estimated 10,000 passengers, many of them refugees. Its mission was to safely transport civilians and wounded soldiers to the port city of Kiel in western Germany. The ship, designed to hold only 1,900 passengers, was dangerously overcrowded, a tragic detail that would seal the fate of thousands on board. The Wilhelm Gustloff had once been a symbol of Nazi propaganda, a cruise liner for the Strength Through Joy program, designed to promote the ideal of leisure for the working class. But by 1945, it was a floating lifeboat for civilians escaping the horrors of war. The passengers were crammed into every available space, their faces marked by fear and exhaustion, knowing that safety was uncertain. Despite the looming Soviet threat, many believed the icy waters of the Baltic Sea would be a safer path than remaining on land. The sea was seen as a possible escape from the relentless Soviet onslaught, but in truth, it was an unforgiving environment. The Wilhelm Gustloff set sail with minimal protection, accompanied by a handful of smaller vessels, but it was vulnerable both to the freezing elements and to enemy submarines. As the ship made its way through the dark waters, hope for survival seemed to flicker, but it was a hope shrouded in the uncertainty of war. Beneath the freezing waves lurked a danger that no one on board could have foreseen. The crew navigated the icy seas cautiously, but there was little they could do against the advanced Soviet submarines that patrolled the Baltic. The Wilhelm Gustloff was equipped with some armaments, but it was by no means prepared for full-scale naval warfare. With the ship heavily burdened by thousands of passengers, it could not outrun any approaching threat. Many of the military personnel on board were wounded and in no condition to defend themselves or the ship. The civilian passengers, many of them young children, were unprepared for the brutal realities of a sinking vessel. Throughout the day, the ship sailed on, with the freezing cold gripping every soul on board. Some of the passengers huddled together for warmth, while others simply stared out into the black, frigid sea. It was a tense and solemn journey where the only sound was the creaking of the ship and the howling wind outside. Little did they know, they were being tracked. Just a few hours after setting sail, the Wilhelm Gustloff was detected by the Soviet submarine S-13, commanded by Captain Alexander Marinesko. Hidden beneath the surface, the submarine waited patiently, following the ship's path as it cruised through the dark, icy waters. The crew of the S-13 knew they had a valuable target. As night fell, the temperatures plummeted further, making the journey even more treacherous. Inside the Wilhelm Gustloff, the mood was grim. Most of the passengers were aware that their safety was not guaranteed, but few could have imagined the scale of the disaster about to unfold. Beneath the waves, the Soviet submarine moved into position, preparing to strike. At approximately 9 p.m., the S-13 launched its attack. 3 torpedoes were fired, all striking the Wilhelm Gustloff with deadly precision. The first hit the bow, the second struck amidships, and the third detonated near the engine room. Panic and chaos erupted almost immediately. The once calm ship turned into a scene of unimaginable horror as the icy waters began to flood the compartments. Many of the passengers were trapped below deck, unable to escape as the ship began to sink. The freezing temperatures outside made the lifeboats nearly useless, as many who attempted to escape into the sea quickly succumbed to the cold. The sheer volume of passengers made any organized evacuation impossible. Despite the efforts of the crew, the Wilhelm Gustloff began to sink rapidly. Within 45 minutes, the massive ship had disappeared beneath the waves, taking thousands of lives with it. The once proud symbol of Nazi leisure had become the site of one of the greatest maritime disasters in history. In those freezing waters, hope drowned alongside the ship. By the time rescue vessels arrived, it was too late for most. Out of the estimated 10,000 people on board, only around 1,200 were rescued. The rest perished in the cold waters of the Baltic, marking the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff as the deadliest ship disaster in history, with a death toll that far exceeded even that of the Titanic. As the Wilhelm Gustloff sailed through the icy Baltic Sea, tension and fear gripped its passengers. They knew the waters held dangers, but few could have predicted the scale of what was to come. When the Soviet submarine S-13 launched 3 deadly torpedoes at the ship, chaos erupted on board. Thousands of lives were lost within minutes as freezing waters flooded the vessel. Despite heroic efforts to save as many as possible, the overcrowded ship's fate was sealed. Of the 10,000 passengers, only around 1,200 survived. The sinking became the deadliest maritime disaster in history, yet its legacy is often forgotten in the shadows of World War II's devastation. The scale of the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster is difficult to comprehend. Over 9,000 lives were lost, making it the largest loss of life in a single shipwreck in history. Yet, for decades, the tragedy remained relatively unknown outside of Germany. Unlike the sinking of the Titanic, which captured the world's imagination, the Wilhelm Gustloff was a disaster that occurred in the shadow of the broader horrors of World War II. In the aftermath of the sinking, the world's attention was elsewhere. The Allies were advancing on all fronts, and the Third Reich was in its death throes. As the war in Europe came to a close, the plight of the Wilhelm Gustloff's passengers was overshadowed by the immense suffering and destruction that defined the final months of the conflict. The sinking became just another grim statistic in the annals of war. Many survivors carried the trauma of that night with them for the rest of their lives. Those who lived through the freezing waters and the horror of the sinking often found it difficult to speak about what they had witnessed. For them, the disaster was not just about the loss of the ship, it was about the loss of family, friends, and the life they once knew. In Germany, the disaster was recognized, but it was not widely commemorated. The defeat of the Nazi regime brought with it a period of reckoning, and the Wilhelm Gustloff, as a symbol of Nazi propaganda, was not something to be celebrated. Its association with the regime likely contributed to its omission from the broader narratives of World War II's tragedies. However, the scale of the loss could not be ignored forever. Over time, historians and writers began to revisit the events of that night, uncovering stories of heroism, survival, and unimaginable loss. One of the most prominent works to bring the tragedy to a wider audience was Günter Grass's 2010 novel Crab Walk, which explores the sinking and its lingering impact on German memory. For the Soviets, the sinking was seen as a military victory. Captain Alexander Marinesko was later celebrated as a hero. although his actions would be viewed differently in the post-war world. The question of whether the attack was justified has been debated by historians, with some seeing it as a necessary wartime action and others questioning the targeting of a ship carrying thousands of civilians. Despite these debates, the fact remains that the Wilhelm Gustloff's sinking represents one of the greatest civilian maritime tragedies of all time. The loss of life was staggering, and the event itself serves as a haunting reminder of the civilian toll in times of war. Unlike other shipwrecks that have become part of popular culture, the Wilhelm Gustloff story is one of silence buried beneath the larger narrative of the war. The wreck of the ship still lies beneath the Baltic Sea, its rusted hull serving as a watery grave for thousands of souls. Over the years, divers have explored the wreck, but the site is treated with reverence. It is a war grave, a solemn reminder of the horrors of conflict, and a place of mourning for those who lost loved ones on that fateful night. Today, there are efforts to ensure that the memory of the Wilhelm Gustloff is preserved. Memorials have been erected, and the story of the ship's final voyage has been told in books, documentaries, and historical accounts. Though it may never have the same recognition as other maritime disasters, its importance in the history of World War II is undeniable. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff is not just a tale of war, it is a human tragedy, a story of lives lost, families torn apart, and a desperate escape that ended in catastrophe. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, not only for the scale of the disaster, but for the lessons it holds about the devastating impact of war on civilians. As the years pass and survivors fade, it is up to future generations to keep the memory of the Wilhelm Gustloff alive. The tragedy, once forgotten, is now part of the broader history of human suffering during World War II, and in that history, the voices of the lost still echo through the waters of the Baltic Sea.
Imagine, if you will, the Baltic Sea in January of 1945.
Oh, brutal.
Yeah, the dead of winter.
Frigid.
It is. And picture this ship packed with thousands trying to escape a war zone, desperately hoping for safety.
Yeah.
And this isn't the Titanic we're talking about, although the scale of the disaster we're about to dive into is almost unimaginable.
It's true, and most people haven't even heard of it. The Wilhelm Gustloff.
The Wilhelm Gustloff, right?
Over 9,000 lives gone in what remains the deadliest maritime disaster in history.
It really is a stark reminder of how quickly things can change, especially in wartime.
Absolutely.
You know, this vessel, the Wilhelm Gustloff, it was once a luxury liner.
It's true.
A symbol, really, of Nazi Germany's Strength Through Joy program.
Right.
This thing was designed to showcase, a life of leisure and prosperity for the working class.
Propaganda at its finest, really.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Showing off this life that most people, couldn't even dream of. But then, by 1945, as the war is nearing its end, the ship transforms. It becomes this desperate vessel of escape.
A complete 180.
Totally.
Yeah.
For civilians fleeing the advancing Soviet army.
We're talking women, children, wounded soldiers,
right,
all crammed onto the ship that was originally designed to carry less than 2,000 people.
It's hard to fathom.
Now carrying over 10,000 souls.
Yeah.
All desperate for a lifeline, all fleeing the Eastern Front.
Yeah, as part of Operation Hannibal,
right,
which was this massive, chaotic evacuation of German troops and civilians.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine the desperation, the fear during that time?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just total chaos.
And to make matters worse, this wasn't just about, escaping a war zone.
Right.
The Wilhelm Gustloff had to navigate the Baltic Sea in the dead of winter.
Oh, treacherous.
Ice, storms, the constant threat of submarine attacks.
A recipe for disaster.
It really was, and lurking beneath those waves was the Soviet submarine S-13.
Under the command of Captain Alexander Marek.
A skilled and determined officer.
That's what they say.
Yeah.
And his crew, they were on a mission to disrupt this German evacuation.
Hunting for targets.
Yeah, they had no idea they were about to cross paths with a ship that would seal their fate in history.
And it's important to remember, right, the Wilhelm Gustloff, yeah, it was packed with refugees, but it was still considered a military vessel by the Soviets.
Making it a target.
Yeah, a target, it's easy to judge in hindsight.
Sure.
But in the heat of war, with limited information,
Absolutely.
the stage was set for a tragedy of unimaginable proportions.
Really was.
It's hard to imagine the weight of anticipation, of anxiety hanging in the air.
Oh, absolutely. It's January 30th, 1945, around 9:00 p.m.
Thousands on board, fleeing for their lives.
So many already deeply affected by the war,
Right, fleeing their homes, their lives.
Uprooted, everything they knew, gone.
And now, on this ship, hoping against hope?
That they were finally escaping the clutches of the Eastern Front, that they were finally safe.
And then
their worst nightmare.
the S-13 fires?
3 torpedoes,
3 direct hits.
crippling the Wilhelm Gustloff.
One tearing through the bow, another right into the middle of the ship.
The final one near the engine room, just devastating.
I mean, you can only try to imagine the chaos, the absolute pandemonium.
The sources we have, they don't hold back.
Right, it's horrifying.
They paint this picture of utter chaos.
Lights going out, the roar of the explosions, the screams.
The screams are the worst part. Men, women, children, all terrified. Just unimaginable terror.
And the ship itself, already overcrowded, ill-equipped for any disaster, let alone something of this magnitude.
Right. It begins to sink, and it sinks rapidly.
People trampled in the rush for the lifeboats.
Families separated, mothers desperately trying to hold on to their children. It's heartbreaking.
All of this unfolding in the freezing darkness.
The Baltic winter, unforgiving.
It's just a brutal, brutal situation.
And the lifeboats, they were never enough, not even close. Tragically insufficient for the sheer number of people on board.
Leaving thousands stranded, trapped.
The Wilhelm Gustloff, once a symbol of strength, of luxury, now a symbol of desperation, of fear, sinking beneath the waves.
In just 45 minutes.
45 minutes, that's it, just gone.
It's hard to even fathom.
Out of an estimated 10,000 people, only around 1,200 survived.
The deadliest shipwreck in history.
A tragedy of unimaginable proportions.
You know, it's hard to reconcile the scale of this tragedy, the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff.
Yeah.
More lives lost than the Titanic.
Right.
And yet so many people have never even heard of it.
It's true. It really is. And it begs the question, why?
Why this event, this horrific event, remained buried for so long, almost forgotten.
It's complicated, like a perfect storm of circumstances that led to this kind of collective amnesia.
Okay, so break it down for me. What led to this silence?
Well, you got to consider the timing.
Okay.
It sank in January 1945.
Right at the end.
Just months before the end of the war. The world, it was consumed by this global conflict.
So everything else, even a tragedy of this magnitude, it got lost in the noise.
Exactly. I mean, you had battles raging, victories, losses on a scale that dwarfed, frankly, most other events.
Right, but still, thousands of lives, it's hard to grasp.
Yeah, absolutely. And for the survivors, those who lived through that night,
I can't even imagine.
the trauma was immense, unimaginable, really.
Yeah.
To witness that kind of suffering, the loss, the terror, speaking about it, reliving it, I mean...
It would be unbearable for many.
Absolutely. Silence. For many, it became a shield.
A way to cope, to protect themselves from those memories.
Exactly. And then you add the political dimension.
Right. Post-war Germany.
Yeah, there was this reluctance to even talk about the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was this symbol of the Nazi regime.
And it's sinking, even with all the civilian casualties, it was still seen as somehow connected to the regime's downfall.
In a way, yes. A very complex, very sensitive issue.
So the tragedy was almost silenced twice.
You could say that.
First by the war, and then by the weight of history itself.
And we can't forget the Soviet side of this.
Right, because for them, it was a military victory.
Absolutely. A major blow to the German evacuation effort.
And Captain Marinesko.
He was hailed as a hero back in the Soviet Union.
Of course, but looking back, it's hard not to wrestle with the ethics of it all.
Targeting a ship packed with refugees, women, children.
Yeah, it's a moral gray area, to say the least.
War is full of them, those gray areas.
Decisions made in the heat of the moment, with limited information, they rarely are clear-cut.
It's true. And the Wilhelm Gustloff, it's a stark reminder of that, of the complexities of war, the blurred lines, and the human cost, always the human cost.
It makes you think about how we remember, how we uncover these hidden stories, even the painful ones.
Absolutely. And that's where stories, literature, they can play a part.
You're thinking of Günter Grass, Crab Walk.
Exactly. He brought the Wilhelm Gustloff back into the light, forced people to confront this tragedy.
It's a reminder that these stories, these lives, they deserve to be remembered.
They do. Even decades later, the Wilhelm Gustloff, it wasn't just a footnote in the war, it was a human tragedy.
Of unimaginable proportions.
A reminder of what happens when civilians get caught in the crossfire, the true costs of conflict.
A story that stays with you, leaves you questioning, thinking.
It does, and it makes you want to learn more to ensure nothing like this ever happens again.
And that's what we've tried to do today, to delve into this forgotten tragedy, to honor the victims, the survivors.
To learn from the past.
Exactly, and to never forget. So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to keep asking those questions, to keep the memory of the Wilhelm Gustloff alive.
The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff was not just a tragic event, but a profound human catastrophe. The ship, once a symbol of Nazi propaganda, became a graveyard for thousands of civilians, marking the end of countless lives in the icy waters of the Baltic. Though historians and writers have worked to revive its memory, the disaster remains underrepresented in the broader narrative of World War II. As we remember this tragedy, we are reminded of the civilians who bear the brunt of war's cruelty. The loss of the Wilhelm Gustloff serves as a stark testament to the horrors of conflict and a reminder of the human cost of war.